According to the Britannica, automobile racing, known also as motor racing, began soon after the invention of gasoline-fueled internal combustion engines in the 1880s. In 1895, the first automobile race was held, from Paris to Bordeaux, France and back, a distance of 1,178 kilometers, or in other words, a massive 732 miles. From there, over the next 78 years, automobile racing was dominated by physical races on real tracks with hundreds upon hundreds of skilled drivers showcasing their racing talents behind the wheel of a variety of cars, ranging from modest commuter cars to fast and highly sophisticated race cars. Then, as technology advanced and the gaming industry boomed, automobile racing went virtual with the release of the first racing video game, a video game created by Atari that went by the name of Space Race. Space Race was released in 1973, and it was a game where two players took control of spaceships in an attempt to be the first to cross the screen. The last time I checked, spaceships aren't automobiles, but Space Race laid the foundation for the games that came after it, which included 1974 Speed Race, developed by Taito, 1980's Rally X, developed by Namco, and in 1982, potentially the most influential racing game ever created was released. The game in question is, of course, none other than Pole Position, a racing video game developed and published 41 years ago by Namco Studios. This is the game that's often considered the genesis of modern racing games. The 1990s saw the release of F-Zero in 1990, the first Super Mario Kart in 1992, the first Need for Speed in 1994, the first Gran Turismo in 1997, and so much more. Over the last 50 years, millions of people have played a racing game of some sort or another, whether that be Space Race, Speed Race, Rally X, Pole Position, F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, Need for Speed, Gran Turismo, or another one of the many racing video games that have come out in the last half a century. Like a moth being irresistibly attracted to a bright light, racing video games have roped millions of people in due to the thrill and challenge of racing against friends, teammates, and on-track rivals. The sense of accomplishment one feels when they narrowly take a win after an intense back-and-forth 15-lap battle with another competitor, it's incredible how fantastically dopamine-inducing it is. For those of you who found this video and don't play racing video games, I warn you, as while the competition of racing games is excellent, once you get into it, like myself and so many others, you'll be addicted for the rest of your days. That's not a bad thing though, as racing games and the competition associated with them is nothing short of superb. In my case, I have played dozens upon dozens of racing video games in the last 20 years, ranging from Super Mario Kart and Need for Speed to Forza, Project Cars, Assetto Corsa, and so much more. I have invested many years of my life into the racing genre of video games, and out of all the racing games I have played, with 52 days of playtime in Forza Motorsport 6, 238 days of playtime in Forza Motorsport 7, as well as the many hours I've spent playing Forza Motorsport 3 and 4, the Forza Motorsport titles easily take the cake in terms of the racing game series I've spent the most time playing. Turn 10 Studios released the first Forza Motorsport on May 3rd, 2005, but my journey with the Forza Motorsport series didn't begin until the release of Forza Motorsport 3 on October 22nd, 2009. Over the last 18 years, casual gamers and die-hard racing enthusiasts have been drawn to the Forza Motorsport series for a multitude of reasons. Those reasons include stunning graphics, extensive car rosters, challenging yet easily accessible physics and handling, excellent competition in community leagues, esports competitions, rivals mode events, and so much more. Millions of people have been pulled into the Forza series over the last almost 20 years, and while the majority of these people are casual players, there exists a passionate community of players with an unquenchable desire to prove their skills and be the best they can be in the Forza games. Known as Forza Esports, the first competitions took place on Forza Motorsport 1. These were mostly low-stakes competitions where friends, teammates, and rivals would battle it out on track purely for the sake of fun. Of course, these kinds of competitions still exist today, but Forza Esports has grown tremendously over the last 18 years, and there are now competitions that offer big amounts of money to be had. Nowadays, largely due to expired licensing, Forza Motorsport 7 hasn't seen one of these competitions in a couple of years, but in the early days of the Forza Motorsport series, it didn't take long for these big cash-based competitions to make an entrance, with one of the first examples being the 2008 CGS World Championship. The 2008 CGS World Championship consisted of big money competitions that were hosted on Dead or Alive 4, FIFA 2008, Counter-Strike Source, and Forza Motorsport 2. If you want to learn more, I released a video in January 2023 that thoroughly covers most of the events and history of the Forza esports scene that took place between 2005 and 2022. If you're interested in giving it a watch, it's linked in the description of this video. Also, while you're down there, please make sure to subscribe to this channel and like this video for more content like this in the future. Anyhow, in the history of Forza esports esports video, I pretty much solely focused on the cash-based esports competitions that the Forza series has seen. However, one of the things I briefly mentioned but didn't go very deep into was time attack. As I mentioned earlier,
racing video games have roped millions of people in due to the thrill and challenge of racing against friends, teammates, and on-track rivals.
In addition to this, time attack is another reason players find themselves glued to racing games. In my opinion, for a racing game to be good, it must have some kind of time attack functionality, as time attack enormously increases the replayability of racing games. Out of the 238 days of playtime I have on Forza Motorsport 7, most of that time spent playing is made up from the hundreds of hours I have spent in the time attack functionality of the game. What makes time attack so incredibly addicting is that there's always a faster lap time to chase after. Even if you've ran the fastest time you think you're capable of achieving, there's always room to take it lower, and there's no feeling quite like going another 2 or 3 tenths faster after thinking you've reached your peak. This endless cycle of always chasing after faster lap times adds several years worth of replayability to a racing game, which is why it's such a critical feature for racing games to have. That aside, as I mentioned earlier in the video,
my journey with the Forza Motorsport series didn't begin until the release of Forza Motorsport 3 on October 22nd, 2009.
I was 9 years old when I started playing the Forza Motorsport series, and back then, with me being a 9-year-old, I only ever played Forza Motorsport 3 casually. That's not to say 9-year-olds aren't capable of being competitive, but the fact of the matter is that most 9-year-olds aren't sweating Forza leaderboards to eke out every last thousandth of time they can muster. With my time in the competitive Forza scene over the last several years, I've noticed that most competitive Forza players range between 16 and 50 years old, with some younger and some older. Anyway, I got my hands on Forza Motorsport 3 shortly after it released, and for the next several years, I played the game on and off in a very casual manner. I played with all the assists turned on, I didn't care about leaderboard times, I didn't compete in any community leagues or esports competitions, I pretty much only did very low skill AI races. Then, on September 15th, 2015, Turn 10 Studios released Forza Motorsport 6. While still not to the level of Forza Motorsport 3 and 4, Forza Motorsport 6 was a vastly improved game over Forza Motorsport 5 in pretty much every way. Forza Esports mostly died in Forza Motorsport 5 with how disappointing so many people found the game to be. Then Forza Motorsport 6 came around and Forza Esports saw a huge resurgence in popularity, largely thanks to the introduction of the Forza Racing Championship in summer 2016. In my case, I got an Xbox One and a copy of Forza Motorsport 6 for Christmas 2015, and for the first 6 months, I was once again a very casual player. However, once the Forza RC was announced in summer 2016, it lit a fire in me to become the best Forza player I possibly could, as I was almost 16 at the time, and as the prize for winning the first season of the Forza RC was taking home a glorious 2017 Ford Focus RS, I desperately wanted to win, as the idea of having a 2017 Focus RS as a first car was nothing short of awesome. So, there I was, almost 16 years old, with a desperate desire to win the Forza RC so I could have that 2017 Ford Focus RS goodness all to myself. The first Rivals Mode qualifier of the first season of the Forza RC took place in a 2015 Ford Mustang GT around Monza, and when the event went live, being a naive almost 16-year-old at the time with no competitive Forza experience, I went into it thinking I'd absolutely dominate everyone and get the #1 global position with only a few laps of effort. Oh boy was I wrong. A few laps later, and top Forza player Lage immediately humbled me as I was over 15 seconds off his pace and couldn't even get a single clean lap registered. I was eventually able to get a clean lap registered that was under 15 seconds off the pace, but I was still nowhere near where I needed to be to win that 2017 Ford Focus RS. And from there, that's pretty much where my Forza RC Season 1 journey came to its end. However, while I gave up on Forza RC Season 1, I didn't give up on my efforts of becoming the best Forza competitor I could be. Nowadays, I'm known for my unrelenting determination and ability to stick to things until I have achieved the very best result I can possibly muster, even if it requires 15 hours of nothing but absolute sweat to achieve what I'm chasing. This is known as DoABrad in the competitive Forza community, and my completely and utterly failed attempt at the first season of the Forza RC is where my DoABrad mentality came from. I hate failing to live up to my potential, and to avoid this, I will do everything in my power to achieve the best result I'm capable of, regardless of how long it takes. So, after I gave up on the first season of the Forza RC, I immediately headed to YouTube and started watching tutorials from Super GT and Raceboy77 about how to get better at Forza. After only a few days, I got the hang of playing the game unassisted, but I was still unfathomably slow and nowhere near Forza RC ready. Over the next several weeks, I continued practicing and gradually got better and better. Then, Forza RC Season 2 came around towards the end of 2016, and my improvement over Season 1 was enormous. I was able to get within 5 seconds of the fastest lap times in the Forza RC qualifier rivals, and while that's still not very fast, it was a massive 10-second improvement over Season 1. Around half a year later, Forza RC Season 3 was introduced in summer 2017, and once again, I improved quite substantially. I was finally able to get within 3 seconds of the fastest lap times on the Forza RC qualifier rivals, and at this point, this is when my motivation to continue practicing and getting better at the game absolutely skyrocketed. Unfortunately, for the first 3 seasons of the Forza RC, I was never fast enough to make it past the public rivals qualifiers, so while my skills improved quite nicely in Forza RC Season 3, the public rivals qualifiers is, once again, where my journey came to an end. Forza RC Season 3 was the last Forza RC that took place on Forza Motorsport 6, and the Forza RC didn't make a return until almost 1 year later in spring 2018. This season took place in the recently released Forza Motorsport 7 at the time, and in that 1 year time frame between Forza RC Season 3 and Forza RC 2018, I continued practicing in multiplayer races and time attack events across both Forza Motorsport 6 and Forza Motorsport 7. This proved beneficial as when Series 1 of Forza RC 2018 came around in April 2018, by the end of the series I finished in 134th worldwide and consistently placed within 2.5 to 2 seconds off the pace of the fastest times in the Forza RC Rivals qualifier events. It wasn't a huge improvement over Forza RC Season 3, but it was still an improvement and I was happy with that. Then, towards the end of summer 2018, Series 2 of Forza RC 2018 was introduced, and following the trend of the previous Forza RC seasons, my skills saw another big improvement going from Series 1 to Series 2 of Forza RC 2018. For the first time ever in my 2-year Forza RC journey at the time, I was finally able to make it past the Rivals qualifiers and onto the weekend multiplayer qualifier races. Unfortunately, I made it past the rival qualifiers for only one of the rounds, and once I got to the weekend multiplayer races, I collapsed under the nerves and immense pressure I was feeling and had to quit out of one of the races due to crashing into a tire barrier and totaling my car. Sadly, I wasn't anywhere near the pit stops, and as I was in last place anyway, I didn't see the point in limping around the track and barely finishing. Luckily, there were 2 other races and I did much better in both, finishing somewhere around the upper-lower pack and lower-middle pack in both races. In the end, I finished Series 2 of the 2018 Forza RC in 71st worldwide and ranged anywhere between 2 seconds to 1 second off the fastest times in the Forza RC Rivals qualifiers. In the latter half of 2019, the Forza RC returned for another season, but unfortunately, this season was team-based and invite only. While I was in a team, my team didn't get invited, and therefore I wasn't able to compete in Forza RC 2019. And when I first learned about the team-based, invite-only approach of Forza RC 2019, it felt like the last couple years I spent practicing and getting better was wasted for nothing. Fortunately, this wasn't the case, as in summer 2021, UMG Gaming hosted an event on Forza Motorsport 7 called the Late Shift Competition. Having made it all the way to the Late Shift Grand Finale and scoring an 11th place finish against the best North American Forza competitors, I did very well in this competition. Over the entirety of Late Shift, ranging from Rivals qualifiers to player versus player races, several thousand people tried their hands at the competition, so finishing in 11th place overall was a very respectable result. It felt like the time I spent practicing for the Forza RC went towards something, and while I walked away with $400, I couldn't help but feel disappointed as I knew I was capable of doing much better than 11th place had it not been for a few unlucky and avoidable incidents. Whatever the case, while I performed well in Late Shift and I feel as though it was the culmination of all the time and effort I spent practicing for the Forza RC over the years, there's one other thing that I'm even more proud of in the last 7 years I've been involved in the competitive Forza scene. In the years I've been involved in the competitive Forza scene, the time I spend racing in community leagues and competing in esports competitions makes makes up a very small portion of what I do in the Forza Motorsport titles. Most of my time in the Forza Motorsport titles, especially Forza Motorsport 7, is spent in the Rivals mode functionality of the game. As I mentioned in the last video I posted,
chasing leaderboards and running Rivals mode events is my favorite thing to do in the Forza Motorsport titles due to the insane sense of accomplishment I feel when I beat a personal best and move higher up on the rankings of whatever track it is that I'm running. Putting in a countless number of laps to run the fastest time you're capable of and giving it your absolute all and ending up with a top 10, top 5, or even a world record is incredibly addicting.
In the last 7 years, I have spent hundreds upon hundreds of hours doing Rivals mode events and chasing leaderboards in a wide variety of different car and track combinations, from Mazda Miatas at Lime Rock to modern Lamborghini race cars at Road America, and so much more. I have achieved many top 25, top 15, top 10, top 5, and world record leaderboard times across a large number of cars and tracks in the Forza Motorsport 7 video game. That said, there's one particular Rivals mode event that I'm the proudest of and what I consider to be my greatest Forza achievement of all time. I introduce you to the 2018 Porsche 911 GT2 RS Spec Challenge. This event is found under the Spec Challenge section of Forza Motorsport 7's Rivals mode functionality, and anyone who's tried this Rivals event knows just how insanely difficult it is to run a fast lap time. With its 691 horsepower and bizarre handling physics, the 2018 911 GT2 RS is incredibly challenging to drive quickly. You have to constantly fight the car from one wheel peeling and spinning out over curbs, and getting the hang of it can be quite time consuming. If you don't take the harsh curbs of Prague in a very precise and delicate manner, the car goes spinning for days. You could always turn on TCS, but doing so loses you a tremendous amount of time, and if you're chasing after any time within the top 20, TCS has got to go. In addition to this, the short variant of Prague is, well, a very short circuit with most lap times coming in at under 1 minute. That said, while it's short, because of how tight and technical the track is, it's very hard to get clean laps registered, let alone clean fast laps. Out of 121,851 globally registered lap times, 90,200 of those laps are dirty, meaning only roughly a quarter of the total times registered are clean. It's a very hard car and track combination, so anything under 1 minute is quite the challenge to achieve. The hardest part of this Rivals event is the tight inner city and chicane section at the end of the lap. You have to navigate through an extremely narrow city road, then perform a very precise wall ride through the chicane section while also not invalidating the lap. You have to hit the wall just right, and if you don't, it's game over. Heading into the chicane, players are typically going at a speed of 130 miles per hour, and with how sudden and sharp the chicane is, wall riding is the only way you can slow the car down fast enough and get yourself properly set up for the rest of the chicane. You can do it without wall riding, but you lose way more time and have a poor setup through the rest of the section. After successfully performing the wall ride, you then have to very precisely cut the inner sidewalk without going dirty. If your angle is even just a little bit off heading into the chicane, you cut the sidewalk too much, the lap gets invalidated, and it's game over. Players often call this chicane the death chicane, and this is for good reason. Over 90% of all lap times die in this section, and it feels like a bullet to the heart to be on PB pace, then lose it all in the chicane. Also, with the chicane being at the end of the lap, you can't just rewind hundreds of times over until you get it right. I mean, you can, but not without invalidating the lap. In the first few corners of the lap, you can endlessly rewind to before the start/finish line and start over with a clean lap. But once you've reached the chicane section, you're so deep into the lap at that point that restarting from before the start/finish line is impossible, as the game won't let you rewind that far back. The good thing is that, once again, it only takes about 1 minute to complete a lap, and with the chicane section being at the very end, only several seconds later and you're already at the start/finish line to start another lap. I started putting in attempts in this Rivals event in April 2018, and at the time, the game was still on the old track limits. On the old track limits, players were allowed to cut the inner sidewalk of the chicane without the lap going dirty. When the track limits were updated in August 2018 and players were no longer able to cut the inner sidewalk, potential lap times were drastically lower, as among the fastest competitors, cutting the sidewalk saves about 3 to 5 tenths worth of time. Unfortunately, no replay exists of the lap anymore, but before the track limits were updated, JSR Razor JDM, one of the best Forza time attack players of all time, ran a lap time of 55.894 seconds. This lap was nothing short of incredible. It was absolute perfection, and I remember watching it and being absolutely blown away by how insane it was. When I started running this Rivals event, even with the old and faster track track limits, I was only able to initially do a lap of 57.404 seconds as my fastest time. This is a terrible quality Twitter video, but as you can barely make out, the two places where I lost the most amount of time was through the first corner and the chicane section. In the first corner, I lost time by going too narrow and bouncing off the sausage curb, and in the chicane section, I lost time by going too narrow and not cutting enough of the sidewalk. Over the next several weeks, I continued practicing and slowly but surely went faster and faster with each session I did. By June 2018, I reached the limit of my skills at the time and managed to clock in a lap of 56.519 seconds. This felt like a very quick lap to me, and I was beyond ecstatic to be just a little over 6/10 off Razor JDM, especially as only a couple years prior I had been struggling to even get within 15 seconds of the fastest players on Forza Motorsport 6. After running this 56.519 second lap time, I had never been more motivated to continue grinding out laps to see what I was capable of. Compared to my old 57.404 second lap time, this new time of 56.519 seconds was thanks to a much tidier first corner. I didn't bounce off the sausage curb this time, and I was much braver through the chicane section. I was still quite bad through the chicane section this lap, but compared to my previous time, it was an enormous improvement. Unfortunately, a 56.519 is where my time remained with the old track limits. While I knew it was a very good time that I had managed, I also knew that I was capable of going much faster with a more refined chicane section. So, when Turn 10 Studios updated the track limits in August 2018 and all the leaderboards were wiped, I was extremely demotivated to return to the Porsche Spec Challenge. Despite that, even while knowing what I'd have to put myself through to run a similar time to the 56.519 I managed on the old track limits, on January 17th, 2019, I came back to the event fully prepared to give it all that I had. As I mentioned earlier, the updated track limits made it so the inner sidewalk of the chicane section couldn't be cut, and the chicane was already hard enough on the old track limits, so coming back to the event with the chicane being 10 times harder than it was before was, well, intimidating to say the least. Whatever the case, I carried on and began pumping out laps in an attempt to get close to the 56.5 I had managed prior to the track limits update. The journey for a 56.5 started, once again, on January 17th, 2019, and I was way off. It wasn't a 56.5, it wasn't a 56.6, it wasn't a 56.7, it wasn't even a 56.8 or a 56.9. It was a 57.123 that I clocked in. Absolutely terrible compared to my old time. The updated chicane section resulted in a time loss of over 6/10 in my case, and to say that I was discouraged is an extreme understatement. My goal of a 56.5 was starting to look impossible. However, I carried on, and one day later, on January 18th, 2019, I clocked in a time of 56.984 seconds. I had finally broken into the 56s, but a 56.984 was still way off a 56.519. That 56.984 on the new track limits was way tidier than my 56.519 on the old track limits, but because I could no longer cut the chicane, my final time still ended up being over 4.5 slower. My main time losses were from being too aggressive on the curbs, braking too early into the double left-hander, and mostly due to not sending it hard enough through the chicane section. From there, despite my continuous and relentless efforts, I had reached a brick wall and didn't see another improvement until April 3rd, 2019. After almost 3 months of absolutely zero improvement, I finally broke through that brick wall and clocked in a 56.810. I took the curbs better, I was tidier and carried more speed through the first few corners, I was faster through the double left-hander, and regarding the chicane section, I was a bit slower this time. But because of how much better I was in the first half of the lap, I still ended up with a faster time overall. At this point, some seriously high-profile players had registered a time in the Porsche Spec Challenge, and seeing myself slowly inch closer to Forza legends such as Wesley, Azadik, Rich92F1, Box, and Razor was the motivation I needed to continue pushing for that 56.5 I was longing to replicate. My motivation was at its all-time peak, and just 3 days later, on April 6th, 2019, I lowered my time to a 56.783 after 239 laps of immense agony. Unfortunately, being as this was only an improvement of 0.027 compared to my previous time of 56.810, there really wasn't any noticeable difference between the two laps. That said, it was still an improvement, and even despite the fact that it was only an improvement of 0.027, I was glad I had improved at least a little bit. However, I can't lie. Putting in 239 laps and only improving by 0.027 was quite painful. Regardless, the important thing was that I was slowly but surely getting closer to Azadik, Rich 92 F1, and Box. Now, when it came to Razor, he was still completely out of reach and in a whole different tier compared to everyone else. That didn't matter though, as my goal wasn't to beat Razor. The only thing I cared about was purely to just replicate the 56.5 I had managed on the old track limits. Anything more would have been an added bonus. So, the push for a 56.5 continued, and after 3 more weeks of attempts, on April 28th, 2019, I was beyond ecstatic as I had managed to clock in a time of 56.647 seconds. It wasn't a 56.5, which was a bit disappointing, but I was ahead of Rich 92 F1 and was only 0000.004 off Series 1 2018 Forza RC winner, Box. It was a little disheartening that I failed to beat Box by such a small margin, but I was still beyond stoked to be essentially tied with a Forza RC winner. Whatever the case, compared to my previous time of 56.783 seconds, this new 56.647 second lap time was thanks to a variety of reasons. Firstly, I carried significantly more speed through the start/finish line, then combining that with how much better I took the curbs, it meant that I was almost tied with Razor's Ghost throughout the first few corners. Razor pulled away in the double left-hander, but I still stayed reasonably close to him, and exiting the double left-hander, I knew that if I was able to maintain the same distance to Razor throughout the rest of the lap, my PB would improve significantly. However, with the immense difficulty of the chicane section, this was way easier said than done. Despite the odds, I maintained a consistent distance to Razor through the entrance of the inner city section, then the chicane came, and I actually gained slightly. Unfortunately, I broke too late through the final corner and instantly lost the little bit I had gained through the chicane. But that didn't matter, as I still ended up crossing the line over 1/10 faster than my previous personal best. After this, I felt I had reached my peak and that no matter what I did, I would never improve beyond a 56.647. So, I gave up on the Porsche Spec Challenge, and I must say, having spent all that time and effort to push so hard to replicate my old track limits time of 56.519 was, well, extremely disappointing. I just didn't see much point in continuing to push, as I felt as though I had reached my peak. Or so I thought. As it turns out, when I stopped running this Rivals event, a lot of other players coincidentally stopped as well. As a result, over the course of roughly a year's worth of time, everyone inside the top 25 pretty much stayed exactly where they were. Then, in June 2020, 14 months after I registered that lap time of 56.647 seconds, top Forza player TPR Bokit decided to try his hands in the 2018 Porsche 911 GT2 RS Spec Challenge. With a personal best of 56.395 seconds, Bokit beat Razor and took the world record. This was big, as it reignited a spark of competition for this Rivals event. Razor responded to Bokit taking the record by coming back and immediately reclaiming the world record with a time of 56.381 seconds. After this, Bokit fired back and beat Razor again with a time of 56.359 seconds. This time was absolute insanity, but Razor wasn't going to let Bokit take the record so easily. Razor fought back and once again took back the world record with a time of 56.285 seconds. This continued for a while, but the rivalry between Razor and Bokit eventually settled. Bokit called it quits after running a mind-blowing time of 56.114 seconds, and Razor reigned victorious in his world record battle with Bokit, as Razor ended off with a lap time of 56.101 seconds. As I mentioned earlier, before the track limits were updated, Razor ran a time of 58.894 seconds, so the fact that Razor managed to run a time only a little over 2/10 slower on the new track limits is a truly godly achievement. Anyhow, taking it back to June 2020, when I saw the battle that was taking place between Bokit and Razor, I figured I'd give the Porsche Spec Challenge another shot to see if I could get the 56.5 that eluded me 14 months prior. Razor and Bokit are in leagues of their own, so when I returned, my goal wasn't to beat them, but rather to just see how far I could go. Fortunately, my skills were significantly improved upon in that 14-month period, so when I came back to the Porsche Spec Challenge, I was feeling way more confident that I had the skills to beat my PB of 56.647 seconds and finally break into the 56.5s like I did before the track limits were updated in August 2018. I was worried that after 14 months of not touching the Porsche Spec Challenge, I was going to come back to it and have completely forgotten the combo. Luckily, this wasn't the case, and my resurrected pursuit of achieving a 56.5 started off very strong. While Razor and Bokit were in the limelight battling for the world record, I was quietly in the back relentlessly chasing after that 56.5 56.5 I wanted so very much. After 14 months of abstinence, I started pumping out laps again and immediately lowered my PB to a 56.618. At this point, I was only 0.099 off my old track limits personal best of 56.519, and I knew I had it in me to shave off another 10th. I could practically taste the 56.5s, which made me more motivated than ever before to push for a sub 56.6 lap time. Finally, on June 24th, 2020, roughly 730 days after registering a 56.519 on the old track limits, I got this run. A time of 56.434 seconds. I didn't believe it for a second, but when it fully set in that I actually ran a sub 56.5 lap time, there are no words to describe the euphoria I was feeling. It was incredible. After struggling to even get within 15 seconds of the fastest Forza competitors when I was getting started in the competitive Forza scene in summer 2016, running a time like this felt like the culmination of several years worth of unrelenting determination to become the best Forza player I could be. If you have a goal, chase after it with all your being. Even when you think you've reached your peak and you think there's nothing more you can do, continue chasing as you might pleasantly surprise yourself. This has been the story behind my greatest Forza achievement. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.